2022 was a tough year, there's no doubt about it. The pandemic seemingly never ending, with new variants still popping up, troubling supply chains globally. And to make conditions even more difficult, in February came the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The conflict sent crude oil prices soaring above $100 a barrel for the first time in 8 years. Food prices also surged as both Russia and Ukraine are some of the world's largest exporters of grain, fertilizers, and other key food commodities. But even amid all that trouble, Indonesia's economy managed not just to persevere, but to prosper. The IMF even called Indonesia a bright spot amid an otherwise gloomy global economic condition. So without further ado, here are some of Indonesia's top 5 economic achievements in this very tough year of 2022. Indonesia's economy has performed immensely well this year, and I'm not just saying that, the data shows it. And one of the biggest evidence of that is economic growth. While other countries like the United States saw not just one quarter of contraction in GDP, but 2 consecutive quarters, which is defined by some as a technical recession, Indonesia, on the other hand, saw its economy grow by 5.01% in the first quarter, and then by 5.4% in the second, and then again by 5.7% in the third quarter. Indonesia's economic growth outperformed that of many other countries, especially advanced economies. Now, growth in Indonesia was widespread in many different sectors, partly thanks to the surge in global commodity prices, which benefited mining sectors, of course. But the processing industries, food and beverages, transportation, all saw substantial growth this year as well, and this was thanks to the return of consumer demand. In fact, consumer demand contributed over 50% to GDP in Indonesia in every single quarter this year. And this was mainly thanks to Indonesia's successful management of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this brings us to the second point, COVID-19. Indeed, since 2020, the pandemic has stunted and even crashed economies around the world, forcing factories, offices, shopping centers, entire cities to shut down. But Indonesia has managed to successfully quell the spread of the virus and thus allow it to reopen its economy. As of the 22nd of December 2022, Indonesia had 23,115 active COVID cases. That is around 0.008% of the total population of over 275 million people. Indonesia's COVID-19 vaccination drive has also been largely successful. As of that same date, over 174 million Indonesians had their full dose of vaccine or the second dose of COVID-19 vaccinations. That is about 63% of the total population and 74% of the target. This was very important because it meant that Indonesia could implement the lowest level of COVID-19 restrictions, and they had been doing so since August this year, allowing offices, shopping centers, public transportation, tourism spots all to open at 100% capacity. This allows consumer demand to return, contributing a hefty amount, 50% to GDP, as I mentioned before, in every single quarter. So this was very important. Now, aside from COVID-19, one of the biggest external economic threats this year has been monetary policy tightening, as countries like the United States saw record high inflation, some of the highest in decades. Central banks like the US Federal Reserve or the Fed were forced to hike their interest rates in a bid to cool down demand and then prices. But this in turn had strengthened the US dollar and put pressure on many currencies around the world. For example, the Japanese yen back in October fell to its lowest level in 32 years amid the Fed rate hikes. But on the other hand, the Indonesian rupiah has remained relatively stable and outperformed many of its peers, including the Chinese yuan and the Indian rupee. Now, this was thanks to interventions by the Indonesian Central Bank, Bank Indonesia, a steady bond market, but also due to a strong trade performance. Now, this brings us to our fourth point. Indonesia has had a stellar year in the international trade market. In fact, since May 2020, Indonesia has continued to record a surplus in its balance of trade, meaning 31 consecutive months of trade surplus. Now, Indonesia has benefited greatly from the surge in global commodity prices. For example, one of Indonesia's major exports, coal, has seen its price surge by over 157% this year alone. But the trade surplus was